Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to a place where your comfy memory foam mattress, central heating, and fuzzy socks would seem like magical luxuries. Imagine trudging through the stone corridors of a medieval castle, the walls looming high around you, thick and cold, trapping more damp than warmth. It's nighttime, the wind is howling outside, and the temperature inside, well, let's just say if you fell asleep in your t-shirt and shorts, you probably wouldn't survive till morning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love it if you dropped your location and local time in the comments. I always wonder, are you curled up in bed on the other side of the world right now? Or are you listening while commuting through some busy city street? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the grand hall of a castle, and the first thing you notice is the chill. Those stone walls that look so imposing by day feel like giant blocks of ice at night. They don't hold warmth, they swallow it. Even in summer, you'd feel a damp coolness radiating from them, and in winter, the cold bites at your bones. The architecture was built for defense, not comfort. Wide arrow slits let in the wind far better than they kept it out. And the higher you climbed into the keep, the more you felt the drafts tugging at your cloak. You shuffle toward your sleeping quarters. But here's the thing, even if you're a lord or lady, don't expect luxury as we define it today. Yes, you might have a big, ornate bed, maybe even some embroidered hangings, but the walls around you still sweat moisture, and the ceiling high above is a dark, echoing void. Fires crackle in hearths, but heat barely touches the corners of these cavernous rooms. Historians still argue whether people built smaller wooden chambers within chambers, just to trap heat, or whether they simply learned to live with the cold. One mainstream fact: castles weren't designed with insulation in mind. Unlike your cozy drywall and insulation foam, medieval builders relied on sheer thickness of stone to regulate temperature. That meant summers were reasonably cool, but winters, brutal. You would have felt the air in your lungs like it was dragged straight off a glacier. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some accounts suggest that mold and dampness were so common that people believed the walls themselves could breathe, exhaling bad air at night. Imagine lying awake and blaming your sneezing on the castle itself, having a sort of stone breath. As you climb into the bed, you notice how every step on the flagstone floor stings through your thin leather shoes. The rushes scattered on the ground don't help much. They're more for covering the dirt and smells than providing real warmth. Already you're thinking, how did anyone survive sleeping here night after night without becoming a human icicle? The answer: layers of ingenuity, a good dose of toughness, and sometimes just sheer desperation. You'd learn quickly that sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't about luxury, it was about endurance. You shuffle closer to the glow in the room, and here lies the centerpiece of medieval nighttime survival: fire. Not the clean, controlled kind you picture in a modern fireplace, but smoky, uneven flames dancing in a stone hearth, popping and hissing as resin-rich logs send sparks skipping upward. The air smells of charred wood and a faint edge of dampness, because even the fuel was often wet. The fire in your chamber is your only defense against the creeping cold. But here's the reality check. A single fireplace in a room the size of a modern basketball court is like trying to warm a cathedral with a candle. You feel the heat only if you're standing close enough for your boots to dry out. And even then, your back is still freezing. Step away just a few paces, and the warmth evaporates, leaving only flickering shadows stretching across the cold stones. So what did people do? They supplemented. Castles often used braziers, metal pots filled with glowing coals. that could be moved around to provide pockets of warmth. Servants dragged them into bedchambers, sometimes setting one dangerously close to the bed itself. Cozy, yes, but also risky. Fires were a constant hazard in wooden-roofed castles. Historians still argue whether some noble families restricted brazier use in sleeping chambers, or whether they simply gambled with the flames because frostbite was a greater threat. And then there were rushlights, basically torches made of reeds dipped in animal fat. They gave off dim, greasy light and a little heat. Imagine falling asleep to the smell of burning tallow, with shadows twitching across your walls, like a dozen ghosts dancing in the dark. Not exactly scented candles and fairy lights. One mainstream fact: fireplaces in castles didn't even appear in Europe until around the 12th century. Before that, many great halls relied on central hearths with smoke venting through the roof, which left rooms both smoky and freezing. Picture lying in bed with watery eyes, breathing in wood smoke and trying to pretend it was comforting. Here's your quirky tidbit. People sometimes threw aromatic herbs into the fire, not just for fragrance, but because they thought it chased away evil spirits. So yes, medieval folks were essentially inventing their own version of scented firewood, lavender logs, rosemary sparks. They would have approved. Now, as you're watching the flames sputter lower, you realize how fickle this setup is. A log burns out, the coals dim, and suddenly the room grows colder by the second, unless someone, likely a servant, is tasked with feeding the fire throughout the night. You wake at dawn numb and shivering. It makes you wonder how many sleepless nights were spent staring at dying embers, debating whether to leave the cocoon of furs and risk frostbite just to chuck another log on the flames. And here's a fun little modern aside. Imagine explaining central heating to them. So you press a button and your entire house gets warm. Even the bathroom. They'd probably assume you were practicing sorcery. Yet for all the shortcomings, fire was still the heart of medieval nighttime comfort. Without it, you'd be relying solely on your bedding, which, as you'll soon discover, was far more elaborate than you might think. You finally shuffle away from the fire, teeth chattering, and collapse onto the bed, or what passes for one in a medieval castle. Forget memory foam, forget box springs. Here, comfort is a layered strategy, a kind of edible lasagna of straw, feathers, wool, and fur, stacked in hopes of trapping just enough warmth to trick your body into not panicking about the cold. First comes the base, a wooden bed frame, often creaky, with ropes or slats strung across to hold everything up. Those ropes loosened over time, which is where the phrase "sleep tight" is thought to have come from. You had to literally tighten the ropes before bed or risk sagging like a hammock by morning. You bounce a little on the ropes, hoping they hold. Then, a sack stuffed with straw or reeds, the pallet, goes on top. This isn't soft. It's scratchy and crinkly, with bits poking you like rogue toothpicks. Poorer folk would stop there. But if you're lucky, you have a second sack filled with feathers, known as a featherbed, which actually feels cushy and molds to your body. Of course, feathers also attracted bugs, so sweet dreams might include scratching yourself raw at 2 a.m. Blankets weren't simple single layers either. You'd pile on woolen coverlets, stitched quilts, and if you had the means, heavy furs, bear, wolf, fox, even sheepskins. Anything that added bulk. Noble families sometimes boasted about how many layers of fur they owned, because it wasn't just about warmth, it was a status symbol. Imagine the medieval version of flexing on Instagram. Check out my polar bear pelt, peasants. One mainstream fact: medieval bedding often involved a mattress stuffed with straws that had to be replaced regularly, sometimes twice a year, because it got so filthy with sweat, bugs, and mold. Not exactly your washable duvet cover. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some accounts mention people using warmed stones, wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed, like primitive hot water bottles. Others even tucked live animals, tiny dogs known as comforters, beneath the covers to serve as living heaters. Imagine rolling over in the night and squishing your furry radiator. As you burrow under these layers, you notice how heavy it all feels. You're pinned down, cocooned, barely able to move. But that's the point. Stillness meant you kept what little body heat you had. There's no tossing and turning unless you want to expose yourself to the chill seeping in through gaps. Historians still argue whether these elaborate bedding systems were common outside noble households, or mostly confined to the upper crust. Some suggest peasants often just piled cloaks or slept in their work clothes, curled up like cats by the hearth. But in castles, especially noble chambers, bedding was both survival and theatre. A statement that said, "Yes, I might freeze, but at least I'll freeze fabulously." And here's where the reality check comes in. Even under all those layers, your nose sticks out, and it's still icy. You might find yourself pulling a fur right over your head, creating a little breathing tent of warm, stale air. Not exactly the dreamy canopy bed you picture from fairy tales. So, while modern sleepers brag about thread counts and pillow firmness, your medieval counterpart measured comfort in layers. Layers that scratched, smelled, sometimes wriggled with insects, but, crucially, kept you alive until dawn. You're lying there, pressed beneath a mountain of furs, when you glance upward and realize that the bed itself is more than just a place to collapse. It's practically a fortress within a fortress. In the noble chambers of castles, beds weren't modest little frames tucked in a corner. They were enormous, towering constructions with carved posts, thick curtains, and often a canopy overhead, making the whole thing look like a private room within the room. Those curtains weren't just for show. They trapped warmth, blocked drafts, and created a cocoon of relative privacy in spaces where people often came and went. Remember, your chamber wasn't always the solitary retreat you might imagine. Servants padded through, attendants hovered nearby, and sometimes relatives or allies shared the space. If you wanted even a whisper of seclusion, or simply to keep the icy wind from crawling across your face, you needed those heavy hangings pulled tight. One mainstream fact: in many medieval castles, the lord's or lady's bedchamber doubled as a kind of audience room during the day. Business, meetings, even small feasts could happen there. By night, though, those grand beds with their curtains transformed into survival pods. The canopy trapped rising heat from the fireplace or brazier, and the curtains kept your body warmth from vanishing into the stone abyss around you. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some noble beds were so prized that they were listed in wills. They weren't just furniture, they were heirlooms. Imagine bequeathing your four-poster canopy bed to your eldest child the way you might leave them a car or a house today. Congratulations, you get the family's deluxe bed with only moderate flea infestations. But lying there inside your little curtained cave, you're also reminded that the grand size of the chamber outside didn't make sleep peaceful. Every creak echoed, every draught whispered. The bed was your shield against that chill, and against the unnerving emptiness of the space. Historians still argue whether these canopied beds were mostly practical inventions to combat the cold, or whether they began primarily as displays of wealth that happened to serve a survival purpose. Some argue that peasants may have copied the idea in humbler forms, stringing cloth or even spare cloaks around their sleeping spaces to mimic the warmth of a curtained bed. Inside, you feel both safer and strangely trapped. The curtains muffle sound, dim the flicker of firelight, and wrap you in a kind of velvet night. It's easy to imagine whispering secrets here, or huddling close to someone else as the wind rattles shutters outside. Of course, it's also easy to imagine suffocating in your own stale breath if you pull the hangings too tight. And in case you think this sounds perfectly cozy, Let's toss in one reality check. Bed bugs. Yes, even those elegant carved beds with embroidered curtains weren't immune to infestations. You might wake scratching, swearing softly into your pillow, while outside your attendants pretend not to hear. So here you are, in your personal fortress of cloth and wood, layered beneath fur, your world reduced to the warmth you generate inside this miniature cave. Outside, the castle is drafty, noisy, and dim, but inside the curtains, you have at least the illusion of comfort. And maybe, just maybe, you can drift off without wondering whether your nose will freeze before morning. You're curled up beneath the curtains, furs tucked around your shoulders, when you hear a soft rustle at the edge of the chamber. No, it's not a ghost, though you'd probably believe in one by now. It's the sound of people settling nearby. Because here's the truth. Unless you were royalty with enough power to demand solitude, you rarely slept entirely alone. Family members, attendants, and even servants often shared the same sleeping space, huddling together for warmth. In fact, huddle for heat wasn't just a saying, it was a survival strategy. Bodies radiate warmth, and in a castle that leaks cold air like a sieve, sharing that warmth meant the difference between shivering all night and actually falling asleep. One mainstream fact: many medieval households practiced communal sleeping, with multiple family members or retainers bundled together in one bed, or at least the same chamber. It wasn't seen as strange, it was practical. A noble might have their spouse beside them, children at the foot of the bed, and trusted servants on pallets nearby. Privacy wasn't the point. Survival was. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes animals got in on the action. Cats, dogs, even livestock in poorer homes often slept close by. A small lapdog called a comforter might nestle beneath your covers, literally functioning as a furry hot water bottle. And peasants in cottages sometimes brought lambs or goats indoors during bitter winters, their body heat adding to the room's collective warmth. Imagine rolling over and bumping noses with a goat. Not exactly the romance novel's version of medieval life. You lie there, pressed close to others, listening to the shuffle of blankets, the soft snores, the occasional cough. It's crowded, maybe a little smelly, but there's a reassurance in it too. The castle might be vast and cold, but in this cocoon of humanity, you feel less alone. Historians still argue whether noble households embraced communal sleeping purely out of necessity, or whether it also reflected the medieval comfort with shared spaces. After all, privacy was a much later invention. In this world, being surrounded by others, family, retainers, even animals, was simply how life worked. Of course, it wasn't always peaceful. Someone kicked in their sleep, someone else mumbled prayers, and then there's always that one person who snores like a blacksmith hammering iron. But still, the collective warmth kept frostbite at bay. You might think of this as the original sleepover, minus the popcorn and movies. Just a cluster of people, furs piled high, firelight flickering through the cracks of the curtains, sharing breath and body heat against the dark. And you realize, in a castle built for defense, the true defense against the cold wasn't just stone or fire, it was each other. You wake in the middle of the night, nose cold, toes even colder, and the first thing you notice is the floor. Stone, unforgiving and radiating chill like a frozen pond. Even if you're buried under furs, the idea of putting your feet down on those icy slabs makes you hesitate. You remember the servant who warned you, don't walk barefoot unless you want to feel the frost bite through your bones. To soften the shock, people spread rushes across the floor. These were bundles of reeds or straw, often mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary, scattered not for warmth exactly, but for comfort, odour control, and a touch of colour. You step gingerly onto them, and they do blunt the cold a little, but they're scratchy, uneven, and sometimes damp. And the longer they sit, the dirtier they get. Rats loved them, fleas thrived in them, and after a while, the whole room began to smell like a compost heap with a hint of herbs. One mainstream fact: in noble households, rushes were typically replaced 2 or 3 times a year, especially for grand occasions. But in less wealthy homes, they might remain for months, becoming a layered archive of food scraps, hair, and anything else dropped onto the floor. Imagine waking up and realizing your floor covering has its own ecosystem. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some households, people laid down woolen mats or animal hides over the rushes to create warmer stepping spots beside the bed. Picture yourself groping in the dark, desperately trying to land on the sheepskin instead of the icy stone. It's the medieval version of tiptoeing across cold tiles to reach the bathroom. Historians still argue whether the grandest castles really used rushes throughout every chamber or reserved them for the main hall. Some accounts suggest that private bedchambers of the wealthy favoured woven carpets imported from the East, extravagant, rare, and a sign of immense wealth. If you were rich enough to own one, you'd probably brag about it endlessly. But for most, the struggle was real. Keep your feet covered or suffer. Woolen hose were worn to bed, sometimes doubled, and people even wrapped rags or strips of cloth around their legs and ankles. If you've ever stuck your feet out from under the covers and instantly regretted it, you already know the medieval experience. Only imagine that feeling every single time you touch the floor. And of course, the humour writes itself. You know how today people stub their toes on coffee tables in the dark. Well, in a castle, you might stub yours on a brazier of hot coals, which, honestly, sounds like a slapstick sketch waiting to happen. So yes, the floors were beautiful to look at, shining stone, sometimes patterned, sometimes polished, but for bare feet at night, they were medieval torture devices. The trick was simple: don't touch them unless you had to. You shuffle back to bed, rubbing your frozen toes against the furs, and it hits you, no matter how many layers of straw, feathers, or wool you pile on. The real battle is what you wear to bed. Forget pyjama sets or fuzzy socks with cartoon ducks. In a medieval castle, nightwear wasn't a separate wardrobe category. It was simply whatever you had that could keep you from shivering. For most people, that meant a linen shift, a long, loose undergarment worn day and night. Linen was surprisingly practical, breathable, easy to wash, well, easier than wool, and a decent barrier against itchy wool blankets or scratchy straw mattresses. You slip into yours, the fabric cool at first, but warming as your body heat spreads through it. If you were wealthier, you might add a woolen tunic or cloak, repurposed as a sleeping layer. Cloaks were versatile. They worked as outdoor coats, travelling blankets, and nighttime insulation. In fact, cloaks doubled as covers so often that a medieval bed might look more like a pile of outerwear than coordinated bedding. One mainstream fact: wool was the backbone of medieval textiles. Almost every household, noble or peasant, relied on it. Wool retained heat even when damp, which made it ideal for cold stone chambers. And yes, medieval Europe was practically a giant sheep farm. With England exporting so much wool, it became a cornerstone of its economy. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, people wore woolen nightcaps to bed, not just for warmth, but also because of the belief that keeping the head covered prevented illness. You picture yourself in one of those floppy caps, and suddenly all those old storybook illustrations of men in bed with pointy hats make sense. Of course, peasants didn't have wardrobes bursting with extra clothing. Many simply slept in their work clothes, or at least in the underlayers they wore during the day. It wasn't about comfort, it was about not freezing. And sometimes they even kept their shoes or hose on, because who wanted to expose skin to castle air that felt like an open fridge? Historians still argue whether nobles treated nightclothes as distinct garments or just rebranded their underclothes for sleep. Some inventories list night shifts, but the line between daywear and sleepwear was blurry at best. You roll onto your side, tugging the cloak tighter, and realize how differently medieval people thought about warmth. For them, layering wasn't just fashion, it was survival. Every extra scrap of wool, every hood or cap, was another buffer against the cold that seeped through the stone. And if you're wondering whether this was glamorous, well, imagine climbing into bed, smelling of smoke, sweat, and damp wool. Your hair tucked under a cap, your feet wrapped like burritos in cloth strips. Let's just say the medieval bedtime aesthetic wouldn't exactly trend on Instagram. Still, wrapped in linen and wool, with a cloak doubling as a blanket and a nightcap trapping the last of your warmth, you stand a fighting chance of sleeping until dawn without turning into a popsicle. You're half asleep, wrapped in wool and fur, when a sound filters through the curtains. A low murmur, the distant creak of wood, maybe even the faint clank of metal. Because while you're tucked away trying to pretend you're cozy, the castle around you doesn't rest. There's always a night watch, guards patrolling the ramparts, servants tending fires, attendants waiting in case their lord or lady needs something. Their footsteps echo faintly down stone passages, and once in a while, the boom of a heavy door reminds you that this fortress is never truly still. One mainstream fact: castles were vulnerable at night, so watch rotations were constant. Guards carried torches or lanterns, scanning the dark for intruders or fires. For a noble, the comfort of sleeping under furs was possible only because someone else stayed awake, pacing in the cold, ensuring the place didn't burn down or get attacked. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval castles actually employed watchmen's dogs, not just for fighting, but for their keen ears. If a dog barked in the night, everyone within earshot paid attention. You might wake with a jolt, wondering if it's just a fox sneaking around the courtyard or something more sinister. The sounds bleed into your dreams. A snore from the pallet near your bed, the rush of wind sneaking through shutters, the crackle of embers in the fireplace. Occasionally, the faint drip of water somewhere in the stone walls. A reminder that castles weren't perfectly dry fortresses, but often damp and echoing. Historians still argue whether the constant noise of life in a castle made true rest difficult. After all, you weren't in a soundproofed bedroom. You were in a chamber attached to bustling corridors, echoing halls, and courtyards alive with animals, servants, and guards. Privacy, again, was almost non-existent. And then there's the light. Torches flickering in hallways, a brazier glowing faintly, a rushlight sputtering on a servant's table. It's never pitch dark. Shadows jump at the edges of your vision, long and twitchy, making you wonder whether that shape by the curtain is just cloth or something else. You smile to yourself, half amused, half uneasy. Sleep comes, but it's restless, shallow, always interrupted by the rhythm of the castle itself. The night watch might make you feel safer, but they also remind you, with every step and clink, that you're living in a fortress where danger is assumed. So as you drift, you lie somewhere between dreaming and waking, wrapped in warmth, ears pricked to the noises of stone, fire, wind, and the endless human shuffle that never truly stops. You stir in the darkness, not from cold or noise, but because your body has decided it's time to wake. And here's the strange thing. That's not unusual at all in a medieval castle. People didn't always sleep in one solid block the way we try to today. Instead, they often experienced what scholars call segmented sleep, two distinct periods of slumber, broken by a wakeful stretch in the middle of the night. So picture this. You've had your first sleep, a few hours of deep rest. Now, sometime after midnight, your eyes open naturally. You're awake, but it doesn't feel wrong. In fact, it's expected. People use that in-between time to pray, to talk quietly, to stoke the fire, or even to check on the animals. Some noble households might use it to whisper with their partners or consult with attendants. For peasants, it could mean fixing tools by the hearth or sneaking a snack of bread before drifting back to bed. One mainstream fact: historical references to first sleep and second sleep appear in literature, legal documents, and diaries up through the 16th century. It was a normal pattern, not a problem. Only later, with artificial lighting and stricter work schedules, did we start expecting one uninterrupted night of sleep. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest people considered the time between sleeps as ideal for intimacy. It was quiet, private, and thought to align with the body's natural rhythms. In other words, if you're picturing a medieval couple whispering beneath their fur covers while the castle snores around them, you're not far off. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep was universal or varied by class, climate, and culture. Was it a survival adaptation to the cold, giving people a chance to feed fires and adjust bedding, or simply a natural rhythm when darkness lasted 14 hours in winter? So here you are, in that strange midnight pause. The fire is low, shadows crawl along the stone, and outside, guards stamp their feet against the frost. You might kneel at your bedside for a whispered prayer, believing this liminal time is closer to the divine, or maybe you just lie still, listening to the chamber's breathing, until drowsiness tugs you back under. When the second sleep comes, it's often gentler, dream-filled, carrying you through until the first hint of dawn creeps in through shuttered windows. Two halves making a whole night, stitched together by a quiet interlude that modern sleepers rarely experience anymore. The second sleep holds you, but just before dawn you're stirred awake again, this time not by your body, but by the draft sneaking through the window. Castles weren't built for coziness, and their windows made sure of it. Wide in the great halls, narrow in your chamber, they were basically holes in the wall that either admitted a gale or sealed you in with stale air, depending on how they were covered. Most castle windows in your chamber are small slits, meant more for shooting arrows than admiring sunrises. During the day, they let in a bit of light, but at night, they become thin tunnels funneling the cold straight onto your bed. Glass was a luxury, rarely seen outside churches or the wealthiest estates, so your window is probably covered by a wooden shutter. If you're lucky, maybe parchment or thin cloth has been stretched across, letting in a ghost of light but blocking some of the wind. One mainstream fact: medieval castles in Northern Europe relied heavily on shutters because glassmaking was expensive and fragile. Even when glass was available, it was often cloudy, bubbled, and set in small panes. Not the crystal clear view you might imagine. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, people stuffed the cracks of shutters with rags or even clay in winter, sealing them up like medieval draft excluders. Imagine kneeling by your window, jamming bits of old cloth into the edges just so you could sleep without your candle blowing out every 5 minutes. Historians still argue whether noble families tolerated the discomfort of drafty rooms as part of castle life, or whether they built smaller timber-panelled chambers inside stone walls to solve the problem. Some evidence suggests chambers within chambers were real, tiny wooden rooms inside vast stone halls, designed to trap warmth and muffle drafts. The architecture itself worked against you though. High ceilings let precious heat escape upward, while narrow stairs funneled breezes like wind tunnels. Even the design of arrow slits could whistle in a storm, filling the chamber with eerie sounds. And so, as you roll back beneath your covers, you feel the tug of the draft across your face. Your nose prickles, your breath clouds faintly in the air. You tug the curtain tighter around the bed, reminding yourself that the heavy fabric isn't just decoration, it's armor against architecture. Still, there's something oddly beautiful in it. The night has a texture, the wind a voice, the stone a presence. You're uncomfortable, yes, but you're also part of an environment that's alive with its own moods. So you shift, cocooned in fur, nose tucked under wool, and let the castle's draught sing you into the last stretch of sleep before morning comes clawing at the shutters. The shutters rattle, and this time, the noise isn't just from the wind. Out in the yard below, the daily stirrings of castle life begin long before you're fully ready to leave your cocoon of warmth. Dawn, in a medieval castle, is not the serene pastel sunrise you might picture. It's a noisy, smelly, bustling start to the day, and you, half frozen and groggy, are stuck in the middle of it. The first thing you notice is sound. Servants clatter through corridors, wooden buckets thumping against their legs as they carry water up to the kitchens. Somewhere, someone is stoking a fire, iron tools scraping, echoing like distant thunder. If you're unlucky enough to sleep near the stables, the bray of a donkey or the restless shifting of horses will filter right through the stone walls. One mainstream fact: in many castles, kitchens were located far from living quarters to reduce the risk of fire. But that also meant food preparation started with a marathon of carrying fuel and water across icy courtyards. All this commotion often began at first light, long before nobles awoke. A quirky tidbit: some nobles complained so much about the noise of servants in the mornings that they built secret staircases or passageways so staff could move quietly out of sight. Imagine, while you're groaning under your blankets, someone is sneaking through a hidden corridor behind your bedchamber wall, trying not to drop a jug of milk. Historians still argue whether nobles truly slept later than peasants. Some say their routines mirrored the early rising of the lower classes, while others suggest nobles deliberately stayed abed longer as a status symbol, because, really, nothing screams "I'm important" like refusing to acknowledge sunrise. But even if you wanted to cling to warmth and pretend you're that important, the cold works against you. As soon as you lift the bed curtain, the chill slaps you like an uninvited guest. Your breath fogs the air, and the sound of crackling fires from the hall downstairs taunts you. They're being lit now, but not in your chamber. You shuffle to the shutter, pry it open an inch, and the dawn greets you with all the subtlety of a slap. Frost rims the stones outside. A rooster somewhere insists that yes, you really should be awake, and the smell of smoke drifts in, mingling with less pleasant odours. Latrines, refuse, and livestock don't exactly make for a refreshing morning breeze. You groan, you stretch, you rub warmth into your arms, and maybe, just maybe, you mutter something along the lines of, "I'd trade all the tapestry in this room for central heating," and yet, part of you marvels. This is the same morning routine experienced by knights, ladies, squires, and even kings centuries ago. You're shivering, sure, but you're also brushing against history in its most human form, the universal struggle of getting out of bed when it's too cold to care. You drag yourself from the bed, and the cold seizes you instantly, like some invisible prankster determined to make your morning miserable. The thick furs that seemed so luxurious at night now feel like a cruel joke once they slip off your shoulders. Getting dressed in a medieval castle isn't a quick, casual affair. It's an ordeal that tests your tolerance for icy fabric and stone-chilled air. Your clothes, waiting in a chest or hung nearby, are stiff with the night's frost. Linen shifts cling with a biting chill, and woolen hose feel more like sandpaper until your body heat slowly softens them. Imagine pulling on damp jeans fresh from the washer. That's the vibe, except without the promise of a dryer. Mainstream historical fact: layers were the key. Even nobles wore multiple shifts, hose, tunics and cloaks, building insulation like medieval onions. Wool, despite being itchy, was favoured for its warmth and durability. Linen served as the base, absorbing sweat and grime, so the more expensive outer layers didn't have to be washed as often. Quirky tidbit: some people actually pre-warmed their clothes by sleeping with them in the bed. Others left garments near the kitchen hearth at night, though this carried the risk of finding your shirt smelling like roast goose, or worse, singed. Historians still argue whether nobles dressed themselves or relied entirely on attendance. Some evidence points to lords and ladies being helped daily, but there are also accounts of nobles preferring independence in personal chambers. Either way, if you're rich enough, someone else's hands might be the ones tugging stubborn hose over your freezing legs while you grit your teeth and pretend you don't notice. Your shoes, if we're generous enough to call them that, offer little comfort. Leather boots might keep snow off, but insulation is minimal. Stuffing straw inside for padding wasn't uncommon, especially in rural settings. For nobles, fur-lined slippers or pattens, wooden overshoes, provided a bit more comfort, but still no match for stone floors that felt like walking barefoot on ice cubes. And then there's the grooming. A splash of cold water on the face jolts you awake, not in a refreshing spa day sense, but in the wide as pain equal hygiene sense. Baths were infrequent, partly because heating that much water was a logistical nightmare. Instead, daily washing meant basins, cloths, and prayers you didn't smell too awful. You tug on your cloak, adjust the layers, and brace yourself to leave the chamber. Behind you, the bed waits, curtains still warm from your body, furs sprawled like a siren song of comfort. Ahead of you, the drafty corridor yawns, carrying smells of smoke, bread baking, and possibly manure. This is the morning battle in a medieval castle, the fight to accept the cold as a fact of life, to armour yourself in layers, and to step into the day with numb toes but a little pride. Because if you can survive getting dressed here, maybe you can survive anything. You step into the corridor, and it's immediately clear that leaving your bed was the boldest decision you'll make all day. The hallway stretches before you like a stone refrigerator, every draft amplified by the high ceilings and narrow passages. Still, you're not alone. Castle life is a communal orchestra of clattering, whispering, and the occasional sheepish yelp when someone trips over a bucket. Downstairs, the great hall is already alive. Fires roar in the central hearth, casting a golden glow that battles the chill but never quite wins. Servants rush about with trays, benches scrape across the flagstones, and somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon coos as if it owns the place. You're reminded that castles, for all their grandeur, were never fully sealed off from nature. Birds, mice, even bats sometimes shared space with the nobility. One mainstream historical fact: the Great Hall was the beating heart of a castle, serving as dining room, courtroom, and living space all in one. Heating such a cavernous chamber was nearly impossible, so the hearth provided localized warmth, with those nearest basking in comfort while those at the far ends gnawed their bread in frosty misery. A quirky tidbit: some lords employed rush bearers, whose job was to scatter fresh rushes or straw across the floor. Supposedly, this added insulation and masked odours, but after a few weeks, with food scraps and animal droppings mixed in, the rushes were less insulation and more compost heap. Historians still argue whether these communal living conditions were seen as a hardship or simply normal. Was the constant draft, noise, and smell a source of daily irritation, or did people barely notice it because they knew no alternative? You shuffle toward the hearth, drawn like a moth to firelight. The closer you get, the warmer your fingertips feel, though the heat never quite reaches your back. Someone is roasting meat already, fat sizzling and spitting, the smell of breakfast making your stomach grumble. Bread bakes on iron griddles, and porridge bubbles in cauldrons. You ease onto a bench, pulling your cloak tighter, and join the rhythm of castle life. You're just one more body huddled in a hall, designed less for comfort and more for function. And as you chew your coarse bread and glance at the smoke swirling toward the rafters, you can't help but think, sleeping through the night was only half the battle. Making it through the day in this cold fortress is the other half. The day stretches onward, and as much as you grumble about the cold, it clings to you like an unshakable shadow. Stone corridors never fully warm, no matter how many fires roar in the great hall. Every doorway feels like stepping into another pocket of winter. You start to realize that survival in a medieval castle isn't about conquering the cold, it's about cleverly outsmarting it hour by hour. Servants scurry about with armfuls of firewood, because without constant feeding, even the largest hearths sputter out. Smoke lingers, stinging your eyes, and every cloak and tunic in the hall absorbs its scent until everyone smells faintly like a walking bonfire. In private chambers, braziers glow, their coals radiating little islands of warmth. But they're treacherous too. Leave one unattended, and the sparks could turn tapestries into tinder. Mainstream historical fact: fires accounted for some of the deadliest accidents in castles. Stone walls resisted flames, but roofs, floors, and furniture were wood. A single ember could destroy years of labour. So while fire was life-saving, it was also feared. Quirky tidbit: people sometimes tossed dried herbs like lavender, rosemary, or even juniper onto the coals. Not just for fragrance, but with the belief that it warded off illness. Imagine every hearth doubling as a medieval diffuser, except with a side of paranoia about miasmas floating in the air. Historians still argue whether castles were truly as cold and miserable as we imagine, or whether residents acclimated in ways modern people simply can't grasp. Some accounts emphasize the bitter discomfort, while others describe warmth, coziness, and even festive atmosphere in well-maintained chambers. You notice the rhythms of adaptation everywhere. Children chase each other near the hearth to stay warm. Nobles huddle beneath canopies of embroidered cloth, turning dining into a semi-private cocoon. Musicians play not just for entertainment, but to distract from the endless draught curling through the hall. Outside, the moat shimmers with ice, and sentries stamp their feet on the walls to keep circulation alive. Inside, you wrap your cloak tighter and watch your breath hang briefly in the smoky air. It's a tug of war between human ingenuity and the raw indifference of stone. And the best anyone can do is tip the balance, for a little while, toward comfort. As night falls again, you realize the cycle is about to repeat. The drafts, the bed curtains, the restless wakes in the dark. But tonight, you're more attuned to the small strategies that keep everyone from freezing. Candles flicker in sconces, their wax dripping slowly, casting golden halos on rough stone. Servants bring hot stones wrapped in cloth to tuck at the foot of your bed, a luxury reserved for the privileged. The air still bites, but you know how to work with it now. Layer upon layer, curtain upon curtain, patience upon patience. Mainstream historical fact: wealthy nobles often had multiple bed coverings, linen sheets, wool blankets, fur pelts, stacked so heavily that it was said you could hardly move beneath them. The weight was part of the comfort, a medieval version of the modern weighted blanket. Quirky tidbit: in some households, cats weren't just tolerated, they were encouraged in the bed for warmth. A purring, fur-covered heat source nestled by your feet was worth the occasional scratch. Dogs too often doubled as furry hot water bottles, especially in rural castles. Historians still argue whether nights in castles were more miserable than those in simple cottages. A peasant's hut, though poor, was small enough that a single fire could warm it better than a vast stone chamber. Nobles may have had riches, but peasants sometimes had cozier nights. As you climb back beneath the furs, the familiarity of the ritual soothes you. You tug the curtain closed, shut out the draft, and settle in with your nose just peeking above the wool. The chill won't vanish. It never does. But your body learns to yield, to find comfort, not in defeating the cold, but in coexisting with it. And so, in the flickering candlelight, sleep comes again, carrying you through another frozen night inside the thick, unyielding walls of a medieval castle.